The Patterson-Gimlin footage has stood strong for decades, but new, unbelievable evidence just came out this month in Mark Evans' film Capturing Bigfoot that debunks everything. Something is in that footage who should not be there, and after I researched it myself, I exposed even more evidence that will only make you wonder, was the Patty footage a hoax all along? On March 12, 2026, a documentary called Capturing Bigfoot, directed by a filmmaker named Mark Evans, screened at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. This wasn't some fringe YouTube upload or a late-night cable special. This was a festival premiere. I found out about it through a Reddit post that blew up on the Bigfoot subreddit a couple days after the screening. The thread had hundreds of comments, and the energy in there was unlike anything I'd seen in that community. Half the people were saying the documentary changed everything. The other half were calling it a hit job, saying the evidence was cherry-picked, saying Mark Evans had an agenda, classic internet argument, but the sheer volume of it made me start digging. The film is not available to stream yet. As of right now, the expected release is sometime in mid-April, so I'm working entirely from what leaked out of the screening. Audience reaction posts, journalist write-ups, a few still images that made it onto social media, and video clips that briefly circulated before some of them got pulled. I saved what I could. I read everything I could find. But if pieces of it are already being taken down, what part of this is someone trying to keep from spreading? Here's what the documentary apparently centers on: rehearsal footage, pre-shoot film, video that allegedly shows a man dressed in a Bigfoot costume moving through terrain, walking, turning, practicing the movement, with Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin both present and visible in the frame. Let me say that again, because I need you to feel the weight of it. Rehearsal footage, with both of them there, before the real filming ever happened. And if there was a rehearsal, what does that imply about the version of events we've all been told for decades? When I first read that description, I genuinely thought it was exaggerated. I thought maybe someone misread the documentary, or that the footage was ambiguous enough that the word rehearsal was a stretch. So I went looking for every description of the footage I could find. A journalist who attended the screening wrote a piece describing the clip as, and I'm paraphrasing closely here, deeply uncomfortable to watch if you've spent any time believing the original film was real. Another attendee described it as feeling like finding backstage footage of a magic trick. One person in the Reddit thread said watching it made them feel genuinely angry, not excited, not skeptical, just angry, in the way you feel when you realize you've been fooled. So why does this footage trigger anger instead of curiosity in people who wanted to believe? I pulled up every leaked still image I could find. The figure in the costume is clearly bipedal, clearly built to resemble Sasquatch, and moving in a deliberate, practiced way. And in at least two of the images, you can see other people in the frame, people watching, people who are there on purpose. One of them is Bob Gimlin. I'll come back to him, trust me, I'll come back to him. But first, I need to tell you about the man who was actually inside that suit. And before I get to all of that, I want to make sure you understand what we were all sold back in 1967 and why it worked so well for so long. Because context matters here. October 1967, Bluff Creek, California. Two men ride horses into a remote stretch of wilderness in the Six Rivers National Forest, about 25 miles south of the Oregon border. One of them is Roger Patterson. The other is Bob Gimlin. They're out there because Patterson is convinced Bigfoot is real, convinced enough that he's already written a book about it, already spent years of his life chasing the idea. They've got a 16mm camera, they've got horses, and they've got a plan to document whatever they can find. What they allegedly captured that day, roughly 59 seconds of shaky, grainy film, became the single most analyzed piece of Bigfoot footage in history. A large bipedal figure, later nicknamed Patty, walks along a gravel sandbar next to the creek. And right at the most famous moment in the clip, the figure turns and looks back directly at the camera. That frame, that single image of Patty glancing over her shoulder, became iconic. We're talking magazine covers, documentary intros, the mental image that pops into your head the moment anyone says the word Bigfoot, and I get it. Even now, even knowing everything I know, when I watch that clip, there's something that makes my brain hesitate. The walk is fluid and wide-strided in a way that looks hard to fake. The figure is estimated to stand somewhere between 6.5 and 7.5 feet tall, based on comparisons to the surrounding terrain. The arms are long, longer than human proportions should allow. There's what appears to be muscle definition moving under the surface, which believers have pointed to for decades as proof that this isn't a guy in a Halloween costume. So if it looks this convincing even now, what exactly did I see that overrides all of that? Biomechanics researchers at universities actually studied this footage. A paper out of the University of British Columbia in the early 2000s argued that the gait pattern was inconsistent with normal human walking at that size, that the combination of stride length, speed, and limb proportions would be nearly impossible to replicate with a person inside a suit. Other researchers disagreed. That argument has been going back and forth ever since, and honestly, that back and forth is a big part of why people stayed on the fence. Nobody ever produced the suit. That was always the cornerstone of the believer argument. If this is fake, where is the costume? Because if someone built a Sasquatch suit convincing enough to fool biomechanics experts and hold up under decades of frame-by-frame analysis, you'd think someone would have come forward by now. Someone would have sold the story, showed off the craftsmanship, taken credit. That never happened. And for a long time, that silence felt like evidence. Now, I want to be real with you about Roger Patterson for a second, because his background matters here. Patterson was a rodeo man from Yakima, Washington, charismatic, big personality, the kind of guy who could sell an idea with a handshake and a grin. He'd been chasing Sasquatch stories for years before 1967, and he'd already published that book I mentioned, a Bigfoot book, written by a guy who had never filmed a Bigfoot yet. He also had some debts. He'd borrowed money to fund the expedition. That's not a rumor. That's documented in multiple sources. I want to be fair and say none of that proves anything on its own. Plenty of passionate people are also broke. But it's important context, because the film made Roger Patterson famous. And famous, in this case, also meant financially significant. The footage was licensed, shown on television, turned into something that followed him for the rest of his life, which wasn't long. Patterson died of cancer in 1972, just 5 years after filming what may or may not be the most elaborate hoax in American folklore history. That question, hoax or not, has been debated every single year since. So what changed in 2026 that didn't change in the 59 years before it? That's where we get back to what I found. The name Al Diatley is not a famous name. If you Google it right now, you're going to get a pretty thin results page. A few forum threads, one partially archived blog post from a Bigfoot research site, a handful of comments scattered across different platforms. He's not a public figure. He's not someone who ever gave interviews or wrote a memoir. But after the SXSW screening of Capturing Bigfoot, his name started appearing everywhere in the Bigfoot research community. And once I started pulling on that thread, I couldn't stop. So how does someone this obscure end up at the center of something this big without anyone noticing sooner? Al Diatley, according to the sources I found, was a man connected to Roger Patterson's social circle in the late 1960s. Not a close friend necessarily, but someone in the orbit, someone Patterson knew, someone who apparently had a physical build, suited to wearing a large costume and moving convincingly inside it. The archived blog post I found goes into some detail about Diatley's connection to Patterson, describing him as Yakima area acquaintance who had some background in physical performance, though I want to be honest that I couldn't independently verify every detail in that post. But the name itself is corroborated across enough separate sources that I'm confident he's real, and that his involvement is what the documentary is presenting. Now here's where the debate gets genuinely interesting, because the internet is not unified on what the rehearsal footage actually proves. There are two camps, and they are loud. But if the goal is to get to the truth, why does the conversation immediately split instead of converge? The first camp looks at the suit in the rehearsal footage and says it's obviously the same suit as Patty. They point to the sagittal crest, that ridge along the top of the Bigfoot skull, and say the shape is identical. They point to the arm proportions, the way the arms hang past the thighs, the unusual forward cant of the shoulders. They point to the walk cycle, specifically the heel strike pattern, where the foot lands heel first before rolling forward, which was always one of the things Bigfoot believers cited as evidence that the original footage showed a real Sasquatch rather than a person. In the rehearsal footage, that same heel strike walk is visible. And they say you don't accidentally replicate that. That's practiced. That's the same technique, performed by someone who was trained to do it. So if those exact details were always used to prove it was real, what happens when those same details show up in something staged? The second camp says the suit in the rehearsal footage looks less refined than the suit in the original film. It looks rougher, they say, like a prototype, like an earlier version, like maybe this is a different costume entirely, and the connection people are drawing is a reach. They argue that without seeing the actual documentary in full, in high resolution, making a definitive comparison from leaked stills is irresponsible. But if this really is just a prototype or a different suit, why does it still line up in so many specific ways with what we've been told is a completely separate event? I hear that argument. I took it seriously. But here's what pushed me past it. I found a frame analysis video posted by a channel that does enhancement work on historical footage. Not a Bigfoot channel specifically, just a guy who does forensic-style video breakdowns. He got his hands on the best quality versions of the leaked stills and did a direct overlay comparison between the rehearsal figure and the famous over-the-shoulder Patty frame, the brow line, the ear placement, the width of the shoulder relative to the head, the angle of the forearm. He walked through 8 specific anatomical reference points and found consistent matches across all 8. His conclusion was that while he couldn't be 100% certain without the full high-resolution documentary footage, the probability of coincidental matching across that many specific points was, in his words, extremely low. So if 8 independent markers line up this cleanly, how much coincidence are you willing to accept before it stops being coincidence at all? I sat with that for a while. Then I found what might have hit me even harder. A channel called The Hairy Man Road, a Bigfoot believer channel, I want to emphasize that. A channel run by a guy who has spent years of his life defending the Patterson-Gimlin film and arguing for the existence of Sasquatch, posted a video a few days after the SXSW screening. The video was about 20 minutes long. I watched the whole thing. This is a guy with over 200,000 subscribers, a guy whose entire platform is built on Bigfoot being real, and he sat in front of his camera and said he'd looked at the rehearsal footage as fairly as he could, and he couldn't get there anymore. He couldn't argue his way around what he was seeing, so if someone whose entire goal was to prove it's real walks away from it, what does he see that he can't explain anymore? When the believers start saying it's a hoax, that's not nothing. That is the opposite of nothing. But here's the thing. Everything I've shown you so far is still, technically, physical evidence. It's film, it's suits, it's comparisons and overlays and forum debates. Physical evidence can always be argued. What you can't argue as easily is when someone who was actually there, someone in the family, starts talking. So what happens when the story shifts from what's seen on camera to what was said behind closed doors? I want you to meet Clint Patterson, Roger Patterson's son. I pieced together Clint's story from 3 separate sources. A 2024 appearance on a paranormal podcast where he was interviewed for about 40 minutes. A written statement he posted to a Bigfoot research forum that's still accessible if you know where to look. And a segment from what appears to be promotional material for capturing Bigfoot that circulated online ahead of the SXSW screening. Taken together, the picture they paint is one of the most uncomfortable things I've ever read about in the context of Bigfoot research. Clint says his mother knew. She knew from the beginning. Roger came home after the filming at Bluff Creek, and he told her the truth, that the whole thing was staged, that the Sasquatch she was about to see on television was a man in a costume, that the footage that was going to make them famous was not what it claimed to be. And then he asked her to keep that secret. And she did. For decades. She kept it through Roger's death in 1972, kept it through the years of media attention, kept it through the documentaries and the anniversary specials, and every time someone knocked on the door wanting to talk about Bigfoot. So if the goal was to protect the story at all costs, how far would someone go to keep something like that buried? Clint says he didn't find out until she finally told him, years later, when she apparently couldn't carry the weight of it anymore. And even then, once he knew, he didn't go public immediately. He sat on it too. Now, I want to be honest here because this is the part where a lot of skeptics of the testimony push back, and it's fair. Why did Clint wait so long? If his mother told him the truth, if he had this information, why didn't he come forward sooner? I don't have a clean answer to that, and I'm not going to pretend I do. What I'll tell you is what the sources suggest, and then you can weigh it yourself. Because if you were in that position, knowing what he knew, when would you decide it was finally time to say something? The Patterson family, according to Clint, did not take kindly to the idea of him going public. He describes nearly being disowned. He describes losing relationships with family members who felt that exposing the hoax meant destroying Roger's legacy, and by extension, destroying something that had come to define their family's place in a very strange corner of American history. The footage wasn't just a film to them, it was the thing that made their name mean something, and Clint coming forward meant burning all of that down. So if Clint's goal was to tell the truth, how much of his own life was he willing to lose just to get it out? Think about that for a second. Think about what it costs to tell a truth that your entire family has spent decades protecting. That's not a casual decision. That's years of internal conflict, years of weighing loyalty against honesty, years of watching people argue passionately about something you know the answer to. People have stayed quiet about much bigger things for much smaller reasons. And then there's the detail about the suit itself. According to Clint's account, Roger allegedly burned it, not long after the film started gaining serious national attention. Once the scrutiny kicked in, once researchers started asking questions, the costume was destroyed. No suit means no smoking gun. No suit means the debate can go on forever. And it did. For almost 60 years, the absence of the suit was treated as a point in the believer's favor. Now, it looks like it might have been the most calculated move in the whole operation. I also want to flag something before I move on, and I'm flagging it specifically because I cannot verify it. There is a rumor, I've seen it mentioned in 2 separate places online, that Bob Gimlin's wife at some point privately told someone that the Bigfoot filming was staged. I am not running with that as a fact. I found it in 2 places, both of them secondhand, with no primary source attached. I'm mentioning it because it exists and because I think you deserve to know what's circulating, but I'm setting it aside. I don't build arguments on rumors I can't trace, because if the goal here is to get to the truth, how careful do you have to be about what you choose to believe along the way? What I can trace, and what I did trace all the way to the end of the line, is Bob Gimlin himself. I want to be fair to Bob Gimlin before I say anything else, because I think fairness matters here, and because I think he's been somewhat overlooked in the broader Bigfoot conversation in favor of Patterson's more colorful personality. Bob Gimlin is in his early 90s now. He has spent nearly 6 decades telling the same story, that he and Roger Patterson rode into Bluff Creek that October morning, that they were startled by a large Bigfoot figure near the creek, that Patterson grabbed his camera and ran toward it while Gimlin kept his horse under control and watched, and that what they filmed that day was real. He has said this at conventions. He has said it in documentaries. He has said it in sit-down interviews, in casual conversations, in handwritten letters. He has never wavered in the way that liars usually eventually waver. He comes across every single time as a quiet, straightforward man who is telling you the truth as he knows it. So if his goal has always been to maintain that story, how does someone keep it consistent for 60 years if it isn't true? And his defense, the thing he has consistently offered when people push him on the hoax question, is that he was the straight man, that Patterson pulled one over on him, that Gimlin genuinely believed they were chasing a real Sasquatch that day, that he had no idea the whole thing was staged, and that he has spent his life vouching for footage that he himself was deceived about. For a long time, I thought that was plausible. Patterson was clearly the driving personality of the two. Patterson was the one obsessed with Bigfoot, the one who'd written the book, the one with something to gain. It wasn't crazy to imagine that he could have orchestrated the whole thing and kept Gimlin in the dark. But here's where that argument falls apart for me. and it falls apart in two separate places. The first is the horses. Gimlin was on horseback that day. He was an experienced horseman, a rodeo man himself, someone who spent a significant portion of his life around horses and understood their behavior at a level most people never develop. Horses are acutely sensitive to human beings wearing costumes. This isn't a fringe claim. It's well understood by anyone who works with horses regularly. A horse that is trained for trail riding will respond very differently to a person in a large, full-body costume than it will to an actual large animal. A person in a suit smells like a person, moves like a person, even in an elaborate costume. The horse knows. And if the Bigfoot walking along that sandbar was Al Diatley in a suit, Bob Gimlin's horse, standing, by his own account, no more than about 50 feet away, would have reacted accordingly. I found a thread on a horsemanship forum where this specific question came up in the context of the Patterson-Gimlin film, and a retired rodeo rider with decades of experience laid it out in a way that I found really compelling. He said that a trail horse encountering a costumed person at close range in an unfamiliar outdoor environment would almost certainly balk, skitter sideways, or attempt to retreat. He said the behavior of the horses in and around the filming that day, which by all accounts remained relatively calm, was more consistent with a familiar-smelling human presence than with an unknown large animal. I'm not saying horses are lie detectors. I'm saying that Bob Gimlin, of all people, would know this. He would know the difference in how his horse responded. The second place the straight man defense falls apart is the rehearsal footage, because Bob Gimlin is in it. Let me be very clear about what I mean when I say that, because I know how significant it is, and I don't want to overstate it. In the stills and partial clips from the rehearsal footage that leaked after the SXSW screening, the footage that shows Al Diatley walking in the Bigfoot costume across terrain, Bob Gimlin is visible in the frame. Not in the background, not passing through, not accidentally caught on camera from a distance. He is there. He is oriented toward the suited figure. He is watching. I spent a long time looking at those images, and the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing I cannot rationalize away, is his posture. He is not startled. He is not confused. He is not the posture of a man who has just wandered into something unexpected. He looks like a man who knows exactly what is happening in front of him. He looks like a man watching a rehearsal. The straight man defense requires us to believe that Bob Gimlin was present during what the documentary presents as a pre-shoot walkthrough of the Bigfoot performance, watched a man in a Sasquatch suit practice the walk, and somehow still didn't know what he was watching. It requires us to believe that he was there, in frame, oriented toward the performance, and still walked away thinking everything was real. I cannot get there. I've tried. The geometry of it doesn't work. The logic of it doesn't work. And here's the final piece. After the SXSW screening, several journalists and content creators reached out to Gimlin's representatives requesting comment specifically about the rehearsal footage, specifically about his presence in it. Every one of those requests that I could find evidence of was declined, not answered, not denied, declined. That is a very specific kind of silence. A man who was truly innocent, a man who had genuinely been hoaxed by his friend and was now being implicated in something he had no part in. That man would have something to say. That man would be on camera the next day, angry, demanding to see the footage, calling his lawyer, telling his side of the story. That's what an innocent man does when someone puts him in a frame he was never supposed to be in. Gimlin's representatives said no comment and closed the door. I'm not telling you that definitively proves guilt. What I'm telling you is that after everything I've walked through, the rehearsal footage, the suited figure, the suit comparisons, the family testimony, the burned costume, the horses, and now this. The weight of it all lands in one place for me. It has been landing there, heavier and heavier, for 3 days. The Patterson-Gimlin film is a hoax. Patty is Al Diatley. The suit was burned before anyone could find it. Clint Patterson's mother knew from night one. And Bob Gimlin was not the straight man. He was there. He watched the rehearsal. He rode his horse onto that sandbar, knowing exactly what Roger Patterson's camera was about to capture.